Hello, Living as a Disciple students. Just wanted to alert you that I received a Christmas gift over the break, and it's some new avocado socks. So now you will be seeing those in the usual lineup. Let's get started. I will share my screen with you. Today we are talking about justice in the Bible, L1D3 homework. So, justice in the Old Testament. So the major story of the Old Testament, the most important story for the Jews, was the story of Exodus. And it's this idea that God set the Israelites free from their oppressors. Who was God? It was a God who sets us free from those who are keeping us down. And it's a very much a message of justice, of freedom for the captives. But there's also, much of the Old Testament is laws. And even some of these laws that sound harsh were actually a lot about making sure that people were being just. So, for example, eye for an eye, in a nomadic society, when somebody wronged you, if somebody, stole one of your sheep, oftentimes people would react by escalation. People would react by killing that person's family. If somebody killed your brother, you might go out and try to wipe out their entire clan. And that was just normal for the time. So even the phrase eye for an eye was actually about respect for human life. It was about just punishment, not escalation. There's tons of laws about honesty in business, about putting people before money, making sure that others weren't trying to corrupt or take advantage of people in business. There were some laws about just redistribution of wealth. Every 7th year, debts were supposed to be forgiven, and the land was supposed to be redistributed every 50th year so that people would have equal opportunity to succeed. And then all throughout the Old Testament, there's a special concern for the vulnerable, specifically for orphans, widows, and immigrants. And you have to realize at this time, your family, your clan meant everything. And so for orphans, if you didn't have a family, if you didn't have a clan, you were often very vulnerable. Widows, women were considered property at this time. So if your husband died, you were left with almost nothing. So widows were very vulnerable, and immigrants, because they had no family or clan, those were some of the most vulnerable populations in society. And the Old Testament is very explicit about saying we need to have a special concern, a special love for these people. The Old Testament is also full of prophets, and a prophet is a person God chooses to speak God's message of salvation. The prophet's role in Israel was not to predict the future. Though at times they made certain prophecies, their main role was to speak for God. More than anything, during corrupt times of Israel, they were advocates for the poor and downtrodden. A phrase that's been said about the Old Testament prophets is that they afflicted the comfortable and comforted the afflicted. For those in power, for those who were corrupt, their message challenged them, challenged the status quo. For those who were victims, for those who were taken advantage of, for those who were oppressed, the prophets comforted them and walked with them. They sometimes advised, but were often disliked by the corrupt Israelite kings. The prophets were oftentimes unpopular and ridiculed because they spoke a message that was dangerous to those in power. To the corrupt Israelite kings, they spoke a message of repentance, and the kings did not like that. So we're only going to look at one prophet in this class, and it's the prophet Jeremiah. And I think he relates to this class in 3 ways. And the first was his response to God's call. He said, "I don't know how to speak. I am too young." Some people say that Jeremiah was probably 14 or 15 at the time God called him. And he felt like it was too insurmountable a task to take on. He was worried that he was too young to make a difference. And I think I like starting with this because all of you, are 16 or 17 years old, and some of these issues we'll look at throughout this class can seem like they're too big for someone as young as you to do, but they're not. There are so many stories of young people doing incredible things. Secondly, Jeremiah suffered consequences for his actions. He was beaten, he was put in stocks, he was imprisoned, he was thrown in a well. He was not the most popular. He was often ridiculed. there are consequences to working for justice. There are consequences to taking a stand and challenging those who are in power. There are almost always consequences to it. And Jeremiah definitely suffered those. Third, he struggled internally with his mission. He really, at times, struggled because he felt he was too young, because he suffered consequences with what God was calling him to do. So there's these passages in Jeremiah called the Confessions, and there are 5 passages in which Jeremiah shares honestly his doubts, his angers, and his fears. It's almost like his personal journal. And it shows us that seeking justice is difficult and it's not always easy. Sometimes it'd be easier to not have to think about this. So I'd like you to read this passage from the book of Jeremiah, which is one of those confessions where he talks about how difficult it is, and be ready to answer a question about it as he talks about the consequences of working for justice. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about justice in the New Testament. And we have Jesus' example as kind of the standard to live by. And first off, we see that who Jesus spends time with was the poor, the hated, the feared, and the lowly. He did not spend time with the Pharisees. He did not spend time with the kings, with those who were in power. He spent time with those who had no power and who were often cast off from society. And he said that care for the vulnerable was required for salvation. He said, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. He said, if you pass a homeless person, if you pass someone who's hungry and you don't feed them, he said, you'll go to hell. He was very explicit about that. Jesus also taught detachment from wealth, said that we shouldn't be attached to it. And the Jews at the time would have been surprised because they saw wealth as a blessing from God. So it would have been surprising for them to hear Jesus say that you shouldn't be attached to your wealth, that people must come before wealth. And then in Acts of the Apostles, we hear a couple things. First, we see that the early Christians, they shared their communal possessions. They pooled everything together and took care of those who were in need. They weren't attached to what they had. And actually, the original role of deacons in the early Christian community was to care for widows. So the earliest use of the term deacon was a person who was specially appointed to care for widows, who again were some of the most vulnerable people in Israelite society. All right, so I look forward to discussing this in class. Be ready to watch a video about a modern day prophet, someone who felt called by God, suffered consequences for his actions, and ultimately was able to work towards justice. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to discussing this in class.